Hello, everybody. This is Brian here, and welcome to another episode of the Sports Deep Dives podcast. We are joined today with a recurring guest of ours, Brian INGRASSIA, who is a associate professor at West Texas A&M University. Brian, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
Today, we are so in the past, you and I have gotten together. You wrote a book on college football, and we talked about that. And then we also talked about your love of baseball.
Yeah.
But today we're going to talk about another one of your books about the Indianapolis 500. Tell us a little about that.
Yeah. This is a book that came out about a year ago with University of Illinois Press. And I love to tell the story of how I came to this topic. If you don't mind, I'll share that. And what happened is, when I was finishing up my dissertation, which became my first book on the history of college football, I did some research trips. I went to California for a while. I went to Boston for a while. And, I kind of got interested in like trains and transportation, all these kinds of things. And then when I got back to Champaign, Illinois, where I was living, I was kind of like, man, I miss cities. I wanted to kind of spend time in a big city again. And I always say that the logical thing for me to have done would have been to go to California, or sorry, not go to California, go to Chicago, right? Take the train up to Chicago because I was used to places like California and Boston, and I could have done that. I could have gone to Chicago, but instead, what I did is I drove over from Champaign, Illinois, to Indianapolis, and I would go to museums and things like that, Trader Joe's, whatever was there. And then I noticed one time on one of those trips that I drove by the Speedway and I realized it's not in Indianapolis, actually. It's in Speedway, Indiana, a place that used to be called Speedway City, Indiana. And I kind of got curious about that. And I said, why do we have a place that, it's organized around speed? And I kind of said, I should go read the best like academic thing anybody's ever written about Speedway City, Indiana. And I discovered nobody had done that. And then I said, well, maybe I'll just go read the best academic thing that anybody's ever written about, the Indianapolis 500, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And I realized nobody had really done that either. There was some stuff out there, but nothing really kind of serious academic. And I said, maybe there's something there. And I kind of went down these like, rabbit holes where I started learning about the people who had built the Speedway back in the early 1900s and kind of what motivated them. And I just said, wow, there's a story here. And it took me a long time to finish the book, but it came out about a year ago. It's called Speed Capital, Indianapolis Auto Racing and the Making of Modern America. And I'm really, really pleased with the way it turned out.
Well, you begin the book talking about that area, and you call it the crossroads of America. Can you elaborate on?
Yeah, I think that's the official motto of Indiana ever since the 1930s, I think, is when they came up with that term as the state motto. But kind of the funny thing is that it originally started out just as a reference to, kind of like one of the downtown intersections in Indianapolis that they called it the Crossroads of America. And I like to talk about that in the book because what I think is really interesting is that, Indianapolis is this place that, it's it there's no real good reason for Indianapolis to be where it is. It's not on navigable water, right? It's just kind of in the middle of Indiana. And what happened is basically in the early 1800s, the people of Indiana decided that they needed a capital city kind of right in the middle of their new state. And so they found a spot in the middle of the state on the White River, which they thought might be navigable. Turned out it wasn't. And they created their capital city. And if any of your listeners who have been to Indianapolis may know, it's got this kind of weird, like almost like Washington D.C. feel about it, and that's because they brought in one of the people who had worked with the Washington D.C. Building, platting out and building Washington D.C. And they brought him in to build Indianapolis, and it's got all this monumental architecture, right? It's kind of got that vibe to it. But then they figured out that this city, it's on non-navigable water in the early 1800s. That's a problem because how do you get places? Really, you get places on water. And so they had to I talk about Indianapolis as this place that really, really had to like find other ways to get from place to place, right? Whether that's canals or railroads or roads. And eventually it's a place very much that embraces the automobile, right? I mean, we think of Detroit as being like the car city, the place that makes cars. Before the Great Depression, Indianapolis had a significant automotive industry. Even today, Indiana has a significant auto parts industry. Not quite to the extent of Detroit, but what happens is there is this auto industry, and there is a group of people there in Indianapolis who they like cars and they like racing and they like speed. And they figure out that, maybe what they can do is they can build this big racetrack out on the west side of the city where they can do all kinds of events. I mean, we think of it really as an auto racing venue, but they do like aviation contests there. Like the Wright brothers are there in like 1909, 1910, right after they build the Speedway. They do balloon contests there too. It's all about these different technologies that can kind of help people get from place to place more quickly, maybe than they have with earlier technologies.
Also, talk about the fact that up there were some early events on the Speedway. In fact, you even coined the phrase "speed carnival."
Yeah.
So what were those?
Yeah. Well, it's funny you say that because initially, I like to tell the story where when I sent this to the University of Illinois Press, they're like, I was going to call it Speedway Nation. I had a couple other titles I was going to use, and I was like, no, we're going to call it Speedway Nation. They said, nope, can't call it that. We've had too many nation books. Let's call it something else. And title of chapter 3 is Speed Carnivals. And they said, let's call it Speed Carnivals. And I ended up saying, no, I'm not sure that works for the whole book. And we came up with Speed Capital, which is very much a double entendre, right? Of, you know, Indianapolis is the capital of speed, but it's also about moving, people and goods and money and value, right? Capital from place to place. But that chapter 3, Speed Carnivals, is all about how, they start off with auto races in 1909 and motorcycle races and these aviation contests. But every year, for a couple of years, they're like, let's do something bigger. Let's do something bigger. And by 1911, they're doing a 500-mile race. I mean, they had just paved the Speedway with brick in late 1909, like November 1909. And, it's this place where you can drive cars for the day really, really fast, right? I think about my morning commute. I get on the interstate and I drive, don't tell the state highway patrol here in Texas, but I might drive 80 or more miles an hour on my morning commute to work. Well, back then, the idea of driving maybe more than 10, 20 miles an hour is kind of a daredevil kind of speed. But on the bricks there at Indianapolis, they can drive these cars, 70, 75, maybe 80 miles an hour. And they're creating these big pop culture spectacles that are all about bringing in tens of thousands of people to this new speedway, to this new auto racetrack on the west side of Indianapolis to see modern technology, basically these cars go really fast. And I like to say that it's not just about fast cars. It's about something that people at the time would have referred to as like space annihilation. The idea that they're using modern technology to kind of elide the distance or to like shorten the distance between different places. And I think that's really significant, right? This is at a time period where people in the United States, people around the world, they're trying to move things more quickly. They're trying to get more quickly and more efficiently from place to place. And automobiles are one way of doing that. But the Speedway is a place where people can kind of see that happening in a way that maybe they've never been able to see it before.
So during the time, cars are becoming more common as
Mhm.
far as modes of transportation. Like outside the Speedway, horses. Some horses are still around, but cars are becoming more common.
Mhm.
And then World War I breaks out,
Mhm.
and the Speedway, like other places during wartime, has a purpose other
Mhm.
than racing cars.
Yeah.
What was the purpose of the Speedway during the
Yeah.
First World War?
Yeah, and they really don't do races, in 1917, 1918, right? During both World Wars, we don't have racing at the Speedway. Initially, the Carl Fisher, the guy who's kind of at the center of this book, he's kind of like a biographical thread running through the story. Carl Graham Fisher, he initially offers the Speedway to the United States federal government. He wants it to be a kind of like a training facility for aviators. And the U.S. Army Air Corps, or whatever it's called at that point in time, they come out and they take a look at the Speedway grounds and they say, well, we probably need something bigger, right? It's not quite big enough. They'd like at least a full square mile, a full 640 acres, which the Speedway isn't quite that. It's maybe a little bit more than half that size. They also realize that, it's just Indiana's not quite the right weather for flying year round, especially. So we end up seeing a lot of air bases in places like Texas, places that are relatively flat, somewhat windy, but have much better much better weather year round. And so the Indianapolis Motor Speedway is never used as kind of this training facility that Carl Fisher wanted it to be. But they do end up, they have like an aviation repair depot there at the Speedway, right? They've got the facilities to repair airplane engines and so forth, to repair airplanes. They also bring in a group of Italian airplane builders, the Pomiglio brothers, who these are guys who are building aircraft for the Italian army during World War I, and the United States contracts with the Pomiglios to come there to Indianapolis and use the facilities at and around the Speedway to build planes. And they do build some planes for the U.S. military. They're paid by the U.S. federal government to do that. And I just think it's really interesting that, we think of the Speedway as this place for cars, right? It's about auto racing, but up until World War I, it's still very much a place for aviation, and we really see that during World War I when they're building these planes. They were going to teach people how to fly there, but instead they use it more about the mechanical side of aviation. What's also really cool is Carl Fisher. He decides that he's gonna create these like aviation routes, kind of like spreading out from Indianapolis, so that when you've got these flyers who are based at Chanute Air Force Base and other places around the Midwest, so they know where to go, right? And so he gets up on the top of barns. This is amazing. It's during World War One. Carl Fisher gets up on the top of barns or he pays people to do this. He gets people to do this. They have buckets of paint and they like paint on top of these barns all around Indiana and the Midwest, like directional signals. Like, here's how you get from this place to this place. It kind of in a lot of ways it prefigures the aviation, the airmail aviation routes that we see kind of emerging right after World War One. Some people maybe have seen pictures of those big concrete arrows left over from the 1920s era of airmail. And Fisher isn't quite doing that, but he's kind of laying the groundwork for these large networks of moving people and moving things by air as well as overland.
It's kind of neat. It's kind of like the first logistics company. I mean,
Yeah,
getting planes and people and to different places.
yeah. Well, and Fisher, he made his money initially through automobile headlamps, right? So here's somebody and he was involved in bicycle. He had a bicycle company where he sold bicycles. He sort of manufactured automobiles for a while. He's very much about, using technology to kind of help people get from place to place. But, I always like to compare him to Henry Ford. We think of Henry Ford as the guy who, figured out how to build lots and lots of cars and sell lots of cars. And if Henry Ford created what I call like the vertically integrated like empire of automobile production, Carl Fisher, he kind of created a vertically integrated empire of like automobile consumption. He taught us how to, enjoy cars and use cars, because Fisher was all about, he built the Speedway, but he did lots of other stuff too. He built like transcontinental highways, and he built Speedway City, Indiana, and Miami Beach, Florida, and all these other things, right? Where he takes the money that he makes from automobile headlamps and then he turns it into like all these different like fun ways that you can use cars to like travel from place to place and really enjoy yourself.
I'm surprised that the name of the Indianapolis Speedway is not named after Fisher.
Yeah, apparently Fisher didn't like to have things named after him. And he did like there were times where people wanted to like put up statues and name stuff after him, and he's just like, "No, I don't really want to do that." The Lincoln Highway, he was a big factor in building the Lincoln Highway that goes east-west from New York to California. I mean, I think at some point somebody said, let's name it after you. He said, no, let's name it after Lincoln. Somebody I think wanted to put up like a statue of him alongside the Dixie Highway, which goes from like, Chicago, Michigan down to Florida. And he didn't want to do that. And so there isn't a lot of stuff named after Fisher, which is funny because in some ways he's this really kind of flamboyant, kind of over the top character, but in other ways he's sort of modest, where he doesn't want stuff named after him. Whereas like, Henry Ford, there's so many things named after Henry Ford, which is kind of a contrast to Carl Fisher.
Another influence of the Speedway, and this is after World War One. We've got the World War One flying ace, Eddie Rickenbach.
Yeah.
What was his influence on Speedway after the war?
Yeah, Eddie Rickenbacker, he's from Ohio originally. and he was an auto racer before the war. He raced at Indianapolis. He raced at there were the tracks like Indianapolis all over the country before World War One. There was kind of this boom, this fad of speedway racing, and they'd have races in places like Des Moines, Iowa, and I think Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Omaha, Nebraska, and he would race at a lot of these different places. And then during World War One, Eddie Rickenbacker becomes, he starts out, I think, as a chauffeur for like a general, and then they figure, oh, this guy who's raced cars, he can probably pilot airplanes too, right? If he can drive in 2 dimensions, maybe he can drive in 3 dimensions as well. And of course, Eddie Rickenbacker, he's like the American flying ace from World War One. He's like the Red Baron of the United States, you might say. And he comes back to the United States, and there's all this, is he going to race? Is he going to go back to Indianapolis? And he doesn't really race, but he does get involved with a lot of the races after the war at Indianapolis. And eventually, what happens by the mid 1920s is Carl Fisher and the other guys who built the Speedway back, 15, 16 years earlier, 20 years earlier, they decide, maybe they'd like to diversify their investment. Maybe they'd like to take this land, turn it into something else. And they kind of look around. Is there somebody out there who would buy the Speedway from them? And they finally settle on Eddie Rickenbacker. He's kind of the right guy. Now, where does Rickenbacker get his money from? We're pretty sure that there's some kind of consortium of like silent investors in Detroit, probably associated with General Motors, because at this time Rickenbacker is associated with automobile manufacturing up in Detroit. And so basically, Rickenbacker is a front for a group that buys the Speedway in 1927. And there's this moment where people in Indianapolis, they kind of freak out a little bit. They think that like somebody's going to pick up the Speedway and like move it. 3.2 million bricks and all. They're going to move it to Detroit. And Rickenbacker's like, no, we're going to leave it here in Indianapolis. But that's like a major, kind of changing point in the history of the race when Rickenbacker buys the Speedway in 1927. And he ends up owning it for about, I think it's about 18 years or so up until the end of World War II. That's when Tony Hulman and Wilbur Shaw, they come in and they buy it, and they decide to save it once more. There's a really there's a real possibility that after World War II, the Speedway gets turned into a housing subdivision. And instead they decide, no, there's a lot of history here. There's a lot of tradition here in Indianapolis. And so what we're going to do is we're going to preserve it. We're going to keep doing the races. And what I argue in the book is that in some ways they sort of double down on nostalgia after World War II. The Speedway becomes as much about like technological progress as about like kind of, reliving the days of technological progress in early 20th century Indiana and the early 20th century Midwest.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about that, but before I do, I kind of wanted to go across your timeline here. So we're getting now through the Depression,
Mm-hmm.
which is a sad time in American history,
Yeah.
and so the Speedway had to adjust just like every other business or entity in the U.S. So I wanted to talk about the Depression, and then I also wanted to go back to the Second World War and
Mhm.
talk about that time as well.
Yeah, and I'll say when I first started doing this research, I didn't think I was going to do stuff about the Great Depression. I really just kind of wanted to look at like the early years of the Speedway, maybe up into like the 1920s and kind of end it there. And then I got really interested in the World War II era, and I realized, oh, I've got to talk about the Great Depression, the 1930s. And initially, I wasn't all that excited about doing the 1930s part of this project. And then I started doing the research, and I realized in some ways the 1930s was like one of the most dynamic times at Indianapolis. And that's not necessarily because the cars get better, because what we see is that after Rickenbacker and those GM executives buy the Speedway in 1927, they actually changed the racing so that it's easier for, more not stock cars exactly, but more stock-like cars to race there at Indianapolis. They go from, but in the early 20s, we're seeing like these tiny little cars with tiny engines, one racer or pilot, as they would call them, in the car. And then by the late 20s, we're back to like two men in the vehicle. And I say men deliberately. It was only men racing at this time. Only two men in the vehicle now, and they can have bigger engines and bigger cars. And then also racing gets really, really dangerous by the 1930s at Indianapolis. It's not the fastest track out there, but those bricks that they put down in 1909, they're getting sort of old. And so by the 1930s, they're actually counting like how many people have died at the Speedway. I forget the exact number, but they're up to like the 30s or maybe even low 40s by the 1930s, because it's a dangerous place to race by the 1930s. And that's where we start to see, initially they pave the turns with asphalt sometime in the mid 1930s. Later, they're going to pave the entire track with asphalt, other than, the famous yard of bricks at the starting line, the finish line. But there's a lot of kind of technological advances happening in the 1930s. But at the same time, again, there's this kind of sense of nostalgia, right? Like, how do we kind of like incorporate the past into the present? And the way I like to explain this is that historians, when we talk about the Great Depression, we say that, people are looking backward to kind of a better time during the Depression. No, it's the present day isn't so good in the 1930s. They're looking back to kind of the better times before the 1930s, but they're also looking forward to kind of the new times that might come after the Great Depressions. They're both looking forward and looking backward. And there's all this kind of like interesting stuff where that's when in the 1930s, that's when the Borg Warner trophy debuts. They kind of like almost like create traditions associated with the race to make it even more marketable than it might be otherwise. And this is when the tradition of the winner drinking milk in victory lane starts. And one of the things I point out in the book is that the reason why this tradition starts is because, well, one guy just decides that his mom tells him the best way to quench your thirst after the race is to drink milk. So he does that, and then they take a picture of it, and it's new like wire technology. The Associated Press sends that photograph like around the country almost instantaneously, right? Within minutes. And people see that picture, and it kind of becomes this new tradition, right? There's all these new traditions emerging in the 1930s, at the same time that like technology is bringing people like closer, farther and farther into the future, into modernity. They're also kind of looking back to the past. And I just found the 1930s to be this really fascinating decade. They're competing with other types of auto racing, like what's called midget racing. Starts in California, where people are just like taking whatever parts they can and putting them together in these little bitty cars that they're going to go out and race. And so Indianapolis, in a lot of ways, has to innovate during the Depression to try to make people stay interested in the race. And part of the innovation, again, is looking backwards to the past as much as looking forward to the future.
So, all right. So then you decide to record the 1930s, and then you go also into World War II.
Yeah.
Tell me about.
Yeah, World War II, they closed down the Speedway again. I think, what, 1942, 43, 44, 45, just 3 or 4 years, there's no racing. Similar to World War II, except longer now. And it's because, think about the resources they're using to race, right? It's gasoline, it's steel, it's rubber, all the things they need to fight the war, to defeat the Nazis, to defeat the Japanese Empire, right? They need these resources, and there's no way they're going to do auto racing, any kind of substantial auto racing during the war. So the Speedway pretty much shuts down. There is one moment where three-time champion Wilbur Shaw is brought in to film like kind of a promotional movie, essentially a film about like tires and kind of how they're using the Speedway as a bit of a test track to create like synthetic tires and stuff like that. And they go to the track, and Wilbur Shaw is just kind of, he's really saddened by the fact that, there's weeds sprouting up everywhere between the bricks, and the grandstands are rotting. And it pretty much looks like, this is going to be, this is it for the Speedway. After the war, somebody's going to buy it. They're going to turn it into a subdivision. And Wilbur Shaw is really motivated to find somebody. He doesn't have the money, but maybe he can find somebody who has the money to invest in it and kind of maintain it as this racing venue. And he finds a guy named Tony Holman. And Tony Holman is down in Terre Haute, Indiana, maybe what, hour and a half, 2 hours away by car. And Tony Holman, he's built his fortune partly through food products like Clabber Girl baking powder, but he's made money investing in utilities and infrastructures all around the Midwest. And Tony Holman's like, yeah, let's do this. Let's buy this track. Let's rehabilitate it. And let's make it once again a place for people, but especially the people of Indiana, to be really kind of excited about these technologies and about this tradition of speed there at Indianapolis. And really, kind of the last race I really talk about in any great detail in the book is the 1946 race, kind of the first post World War II race. But it's people are coming back from the war and they're very invested in this sense of kind of bringing the world back to this pre-war normalcy that they may have had before the war. And it's just really kind of it's really striking how after World War II, they really revived the Speedway in a way that, I think a lot of people weren't expecting, right? They were expecting it just to kind of, disappear, and it wouldn't be the first time that a racetrack had been turned into something else. I mean, for instance, one thing I talk about earlier in the book is that there's a moment in the 1920s where they talk about making the infield of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway the airport for Indianapolis, and that never happens. But it's a really interesting idea, and you look at the fact that a couple of other major airports they're built on old racetracks. I used to live in Atlanta, and a lot of people have flown through the Atlanta airport. It's built on a racetrack, the land that used to be a racetrack back in like 1910. These people in Atlanta, like especially Coca-Cola money, they decided to build a racetrack that would be better than Indianapolis, and it wasn't. And they ended up building an airport there eventually. It's now probably the world's busiest airport. Something similar happened up in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where the airport there is built on an old track that Fisher and some of his colleagues built right before World War I, and then later it gets turned into an airport.
As an Atlanta native, I did not know that the Atlanta airport is was built on an old racetrack.
Yeah, it was a story I found. I used to live there. I taught in Atlanta for a while. And essentially what was happening is in the early 1900s, they were trying to get people in Georgia to support the good roads movement, right? Like, how do we get people to get behind the idea that we're going to connect places, county to county, city to city? And they would do these like automotive endurance contests, and they would do speedway races. And it's Asa Candler, but especially Asa Candler Jr., his son, who's big into auto racing. And so they put all this money into building this track. And for about a year or two, it's really hot. It's really popular. People are going there. But, Atlanta's nowhere near as big as some of the northern industrial cities. And it's certainly not located, say, Indianapolis is a few hours from Chicago by automobile, certainly a day's drive from Chicago by automobile, in a way that Atlanta is not, right? And so they're never able to get the same kind of crowds. Eventually, that Atlanta racetrack shuts down. And I think initially in the 1920s, they built Candler Field there. And then over the years, they build that into Hartsfield-Jackson. And there are even old pictures out there on the internet where you can see the racetrack, or at least like kind of the vestiges, the last vestiges of the racetrack still sort of existed around the Atlanta airport, maybe up into like the 1960s or 1970s. You can still see it.
That is interesting. All right, so there have been some sporting events which have been around for a long time. I mean, the World Series is one of them.
Yeah.
Wilmington, well, the tennis tournament has also been around for a while.
Yeah.
The Kentucky Derby,
Yeah.
always run in May. And then you've also got the Indianapolis 500, or, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway.
Hmm.
And you've talked about how, they've had some challenges, and there were some times in history where it might have shut down, or that race might have been moved elsewhere.
Hmm.
So here we are, more than 100 years later, and it's still going on. It's Indianapolis 500 is always Memorial Day weekend.
Yeah.
So how has it been able to stand all the pressures and able to stand the test of time?
Yeah. Yeah, they start the 500-mile race in 1911. So that's 2 years after the track was built. And other than a few interruptions with world wars, COVID sort of messed with the normal schedule. Yeah, there's been a 500-mile race just about every year since 1911, which is kind of amazing. Like you said, the World Series goes back to 1903. The Kentucky Derby in Louisville goes back even farther into the 1870s, I think. But yeah, I mean, I think Indianapolis, at a certain point, Indianapolis starts to build its identity in part around this event, around the speedway, around automobiles, to the point where, any of the listeners who maybe are familiar with Indianapolis know that at some point, I think in the 60s, they merged the city and the county into something called Unigov. And so it's basically, Indianapolis and the county where it's located basically unified their government into one entity. And around that time, Indianapolis kind of consciously says, like, we need to build our future, at least in part, on things like tourism and the service economy, and kind of in some ways kind of get beyond industry. The last car factory in Indianapolis probably shuts down in the 1930s during the Great Depression. And I think in some ways it's weird because Indianapolis is a little bit forward thinking in that way, right? Compared to, say, a Detroit that's still in the 70s, still very, very heavily invested in automobile manufacturing. People in Indianapolis, I think, are starting to look forward to, not look forward, but kind of look forward to, look beyond industrialization to kind of a post-industrial moment. And one of the things they say in the 60s and 70s is, let's try to build the identity of this place, Indianapolis, in part on sports. And they do really heavily invest in kind of, making the Indianapolis 500, the 500-mile race, part of their city's identity. That's also around the time, they build the Hoosier Dome, right? And they bring in the Colts in the 1980s. They have the Pan Am Games in 1987. Eventually, by the late 90s, the NCAA moves its headquarters from Kansas City out to Indianapolis. And so I think it helps that as a city in Indianapolis, which is sometimes jokingly called the diamond in the rust. It's in the Rust Belt, but it's this kind of quickly growing almost like a Sunbelt city within the Rust Belt, that they kind of invest in that kind of a future that looks beyond production, and it goes into, all this, again, kind of nostalgia, this looking back and kind of creating cultural rituals that surround automobiles.
And
And
don't forget
there's one more thing I'll say, if you don't mind, and that is that I got curious. I always hear people calling it the Indy 500. And as I was doing my research, I did a little bit of poking around. I said, where does that term originate? And as far as I can tell, nobody used the term Indy 500 to apply to the Motor Speedway race until about the 1950s. And what I think it is that sometime in the 1950s, the term migrated. There had been a midget car race called the Indy 500, kind of a shortened version of Indianapolis 500. And then, like I said, the term sometime in the 50s migrates, and all of a sudden, like, it's like one day after, like, the 58 or the 59 race, all of a sudden everybody starts calling it the Indy 500, which I think is just funny, right? That we have this term that we use, and it's like we can put a very specific moment on when people start using that terminology.
well, what's also interesting is the fact that, like, let's take NASCAR for instance.
Yeah.
Their races are all title sponsors. Like I can't remember if the Coca-Cola 600 is in Atlanta or Charlotte, right?
Yeah.
But
I should
the
know.
and yes, but the fact is that Indianapolis 500 or Indy 500, it's always what it's called. And I don't know if it has a sponsor. And if it does have a sponsor, that sponsor is not getting their money's worth because nobody calls it Sherman Williams or whatever the sponsor is, Indianapolis 500. They call it the Indianapolis 500.
Yeah. Yeah, and this
Uh,
this is where I wish I knew a little bit more about NASCAR. I really focused in the book on Indy style racing as opposed to NASCAR. But I will say there's a really good book I just read recently. It's called The Stadium by a guy named Frank Gurity. And he talks about how a lot of that corporate naming, like corporate sponsorship, a lot of that dates from the 1970s, right? Especially when we're talking about like sports arenas and sports stadiums, kind of dates from about the 1970s or so. I think we see that, and I think about women's tennis, right, with the Virginia Slims tour in the early 70s. I think a lot of that corporate naming starts around the 1970s, and stadiums maybe just a little bit later than that. And yeah, Indianapolis is one of those places that's kind of bucked that trend and kind of maintained, its identity around the place and the event as opposed to a corporate sponsor. But personally, I kind of hope that continues, but who knows what could happen in the future.
oh, I think it's great branding on their part.
Yeah, it's true.
All right, well, Brian, this was interesting, and I hope you enjoyed our conversation here on the Sports Deep Dive podcast.
Absolutely.
I wanted to remind people of the name of your book. It's called Speed Capital: Indianapolis Auto Racing and the Making of Modern America, and that is available on both electronic places as well as brick and mortar stores, I believe.
Yeah. I occasionally see a copy out there in the wild. And I will say too, it was about a year ago, it was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal, which was really cool, kind of right before the 2024 Indy 500. They did a review in the Wall Street Journal, which was nice of them.
Did they give you a good review?
I read just enough of it to know that I think they liked the book, but they were a little annoyed by it too. So take that as you will. But I don't think they totally panned it. I'll let other folks read it and decide. So
Well, that's good. Well, once again, I want to thank my guest, and just to let you know that the Sports Deep Dive podcast is commercial free. That way you can listen to it without any interruptions. Brian, we hope to have you on again sometime, and I enjoyed our conversation.
absolutely. I'd love to be back on. Thank you so much.
All right. So long, everyone. Okay. We'll end the recording there.
I'm going to stop